My husband buys me 5 kilograms of apples to eat every day. I discovered his perfect murder plan. My name is Eleanor Hayes. And let me tell you, nothing in life prepares you for the moment you realize that the man you've shared a home with for decades has been plotting your slow, quiet death. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. I always thought marriage was about compromise, about building small habits that weave into a life together. My husband Daniel had always been the kind of man who liked routines. He needed his coffee at precisely 7 o'clock, his shirts ironed a certain way, and his dinner served at exactly the same place on the table. Over time, I grew used to those quirks. They weren't dangerous. At least, not at first. But then came the apples. It started innocently enough. One day he came home with a heavy paper bag from the farmer's market, the kind that bulges at the seams, and placed it on the counter with a proud smile. 5 kilos of apples, Eleanor, he said. You should eat them every day. They'll keep you healthy, glowing, strong. I laughed. 5 kilos, Daniel, I couldn't finish that in a week, let alone a day. But he shook his head with quiet firmness. Every day, one by one. It's good for your heart. At first I thought it was just another one of his strange health obsessions. He'd gone through phases before kale smoothies, yoga at dawn, cold showers. But this was different. He wasn't experimenting on himself. He was pushing me into it, and only me. The first week I tried. I ate apple slices with breakfast, diced them into salads, baked them into pies. But there was no way I could keep up with the sheer mountain of fruit he lugged into the house daily. The counters smelled of overripe sweetness, and I was constantly throwing away bruised apples while Daniel watched with quiet disapproval. You're wasting them, he'd say, voice low and almost disappointed. You don't understand how important this is. Something in his eyes unsettled me then, a flicker of intensity I hadn't seen before. One night I woke up thirsty and found him in the kitchen. The light above the sink cast shadows across his face. He was sitting at the table polishing an apple, slowly staring at it as though it held a secret he wasn't ready to share. When I cleared my throat, he startled, then forced a smile. Go back to bed, Eleanor, he said softly. I was just making sure tomorrow's batch is perfect. That word batch lodged itself in my mind, as though this wasn't just fruit, as though it was preparation. By the second week, his tone shifted. No longer gentle reminders. Now it was pressure. Have you eaten your apples today? He'd demand the moment I came into the kitchen. How many cores did you throw away? His eyes followed my hands, my mouth, even the garbage bin. I began to feel caged. Apples spilled from every bowl crowded every corner of the kitchen, their skins shining red and green under the light. They seemed to watch me too, these endless offerings waiting for me to take a bite. But what disturbed me most wasn't the fruit itself. It was Daniel's insistence that I eat everything. The flesh, the skin, the seeds. The core is where the real nutrition is, he'd whisper, standing close behind me as I chewed. His breath brushed against my ear, and I felt the chill of something darker than health obsession. I remember once spitting out a seed and tossing it aside. He picked it up from the sink, wiped it dry, and placed it back on my plate. Don't waste it, he said flatly. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the crunch of my teeth against apple skin, the crack of tiny seeds, the quiet certainty in his voice. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. But at the time, I didn't know how deep that wrongness went. I just knew one thing: this wasn't love. This wasn't care. This was control. And perhaps something far more sinister. Here, the tension will thicken. Daniel's health obsession grows more suffocating. The apples become a weight, both physical and psychological, and Eleanor starts sensing that his insistence masks something else. The apples piled higher and higher, a mountain I could never conquer. By the third week, I dreaded the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. I knew what he would carry in that same bulging bag, straining his arms, his expression half proud, half demanding. He placed it on the counter with ritualistic care, like an offering at some private altar. 5 kilos, Eleanor, he said as always. His voice had softened, almost rehearsed. But the softness was misleading. It was not kindness. It was command. I tried to reason with him. Daniel, it's too much. Even if I ate apples at every meal, there's no way. Then you're not trying hard enough. He cut me off with a sharp look, the kind that once might have silenced me out of habit. But now it only made my stomach knot. Your body needs this. You'll thank me later. But later never came. The apples spoiled faster than I could consume them. They filled the trash, and with each one I tossed away, his eyes grew colder. You don't respect me, he muttered one evening, standing over the bin as I scraped out slices gone brown. You don't listen. You don't care about what I do for you. I froze, knife in hand, the words cutting deeper than the blade could. It wasn't about the apples anymore. It was about power. At night, I lay awake, my stomach bloated and sour from the forced fruit. My jaw ached from chewing. Sometimes I gagged halfway through, but Daniel would appear in the doorway, watching in silence, his shadow stretching long across the floor. Keep going, he would whisper low and steady. It's good for you. I began to dread meals. Breakfast was no longer coffee and eggs, but apples. Lunch, apples again. Dinner, another plate of them, sliced thin, tucked between bites of meat or bread. The taste coated my mouth, sickly sweet, until I could no longer tell one day from the next. And yet, what terrified me most was his patience. He never shouted, never struck. He only pressed day by day, apple by apple, a slow tightening of invisible chains. He was grooming me into obedience, molding me into something pliant. I thought back to when we first married. Daniel had been charming then, attentive, generous, always bringing home little surprises. A bouquet, a trinket, even a bag of oranges once. But now looking back, I realized those gestures weren't about love. They were rehearsals for control. Each gift came with an expectation, a test. Would I smile enough, praise enough, obey enough? The apples were simply the final act of that long-hidden play. One evening, my body finally rebelled. I doubled over in the bathroom, vomiting until my throat burned raw. My stomach cramped, and I collapsed against the cold tile, trembling. Daniel appeared in the doorway, calm as ever, holding another apple in his hand. You'll feel better if you finish this one, he said. I stared at him, bile rising, unable to speak. In that moment, something inside me shifted. This wasn't a man concerned for his wife's health. This was something else. Something calculated. And then came the bruise. The next morning, I noticed one of the apples in my bowl had a faint brown spot near the core. I sliced into it and found the flesh tinged oddly, the seeds darker than usual. When I raised it to my lips, something instinct perhaps made me pause. I set it down and glanced at Daniel. He was watching me intently, too intently, his eyes fixed not on my face, but on my hands. I forced a smile and said lightly, maybe I'll save this one for later. His expression tightened just for a second before softening into his usual calm. No, he said firmly, eat it now. Fresh is always best. The demand was so sharp it chilled me. I set the slice back on my plate and chewed, slowly, pretending. When he left the room, I spat it into a napkin and flushed it down the toilet. My heart pounded, my hands shaking. That was the first time I truly let myself think the unthinkable. Maybe the apples weren't meant to keep me alive. Maybe they were meant to destroy me. From that moment, every bite became a question. Every core, every seed, a potential weapon hidden in plain sight. And I realized I was already trapped inside his plan. The apples began to haunt me. By then, nearly a month had passed since Daniel first began his ritual, and the novelty had worn thin. I had grown accustomed to the smell of apples saturating every corner of our kitchen. That sickly sweet scent that clung to the curtains seeped into my clothes and followed me to bed at night. But what disturbed me wasn't the quantity anymore. It was the strange inconsistencies. Some of the apples looked pristine on the outside, their skins glowing like wax under the kitchen light. But when I bit into them, the taste was sharp, bitter, metallic, unlike anything I had ever eaten before. My tongue tingled and the back of my throat burned faintly. I began to chew slower, more cautiously, wondering whether it was my imagination or something more. Other apples spoiled unnaturally fast. I'd place them in a bowl one evening, and by morning they'd be bruised and soft, their flesh collapsing into mush. And yet, Daniel always insisted on those particular ones. "Don't waste them," he'd murmur, pushing the bruised fruit into my hands. "The nutrients are still inside." I started keeping track in small hidden ways. A little notebook tucked between cookbooks where I recorded which apples made me feel nauseous, which left me with headaches, which turned brown too quickly. There was a pattern forming, though I couldn't quite name it yet. What I did notice was this: Daniel was careful. Too careful. Whenever we shopped together, he steered me away from the fruit stalls, urging me toward clothes or housewares. "I'll take care of the apples," he'd say. "You don't need to worry about that." And sure enough, he'd disappear for 15 minutes, then return with that same paper bag, heavy and straining his hands, gripping it as though it contained gold. At first, I tried to laugh it off. "Are you hiding a secret orchard somewhere?" I teased one day, trying to pry. His jaw stiffened and he gave me that look, the one that told me he'd already closed the door on conversation. "Just trust me, Eleanor," he said. "I know what's best for you." Those words, once comforting in our early years, now sounded like a sentence. The strangest part was how possessive he was about the apples. He never ate them himself. Not once. I'd offer him slices, baked pies, even fresh cider, but he always declined with a smile. "They're for you," he insisted. "I already get my nutrients elsewhere." Elsewhere. The word gnawed at me. What did that mean? Where did his nourishment come from, if not the very thing he forced on me day after day? One afternoon, I decided to test him. I deliberately left the paper bag untouched on the counter, unopened. The apples sat there sweating slightly in the warm air, waiting. I busied myself with chores, watching from the corner of my eye. Sure enough, Daniel walked in, glanced at the bag, and frowned. "Why haven't you eaten yet?" he asked, voice cool. "I was saving them for dinner," I replied, keeping my tone light. He didn't buy it. He moved to the bag, opened it himself, and pulled one out. He polished it with his sleeve, then placed it directly in my hand. His eyes locked onto mine with a weight that made my chest tighten. Now, he said softly, almost tenderly, but his grip on my wrist was firm. Too firm. I lifted the apple to my lips and bit. The skin cracked, juice spilling onto my chin. It tasted bitter again, that same acrid sharpness that lingered like smoke. I forced myself to chew my throat tight and swallowed under his gaze. Only then did he release me satisfied. When he turned away, I spat the rest of the bite into my napkin, heart racing. I flushed it down the sink before he noticed. It was becoming clear Daniel wasn't just encouraging me. He was monitoring me. Each apple consumed was a victory for him, a step in some private plan I had yet to uncover. That night, unable to sleep, I lay awake listening to the rhythm of his breath beside me. My mind churned with questions I didn't dare voice. Why apples? Why me? And why this unyielding insistence that I eat them, whole seeds and all? I remembered how he had corrected me once when I left a few cores on my plate. He'd pick them up one by one and drop them back into my hand. "Finish," he said. "Don't throw away the most important part." The most important part. I couldn't shake those words. Seeds. The cores. Tiny, bitter, unnecessary things. What kind of nutrients could they possibly contain? The next morning, when he left for work, I sat down at the kitchen table with my notebook and a pot of tea. My hands trembled as I flipped to a blank page and wrote one question at the top. What's inside an apple seed? I didn't know the answer yet. But I had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, Daniel already did. And he was counting on me never asking. Daniel loved to play the part of the doting husband. To anyone outside our home, he was attentive, considerate, the kind of man women whispered about with envy and men nodded at with respect. He had perfected that role long ago, but now he'd found a new performance prop: the apples. At church gatherings, at neighborhood barbecues, even casual dinners with friends, Daniel would always find a way to mention it. My Eleanor is the healthiest woman I know, he'd boast, with a proud smile resting his hand on my shoulder as though claiming a trophy. 5 kilograms of apples every single day. Isn't that incredible discipline? People would gasp, laugh, shake their heads in disbelief. Some even applauded me, though their compliments were always mixed with confusion. "How do you manage that?" a friend once asked, leaning in with wide eyes. I forced a smile, lips tight against the truth. "It's not easy," I admitted. But before I could say more, Daniel interjected smoothly, his voice rich with admiration. "She's strong. I make sure she stays on track. That's what a good husband does. He keeps his wife healthy." The group laughed and nodded, praising his devotion. No one noticed the flicker of something else in his eyes, a private satisfaction darker than pride. In those moments I felt invisible. Not a woman, but a puppet moving to his cues. The apples weren't just fruit anymore. They were proof of his control displayed for the world as evidence of his perfection. Behind closed doors, the performance continued, but without the charm. At home, he no longer asked if I'd eaten my apples. He expected it. He counted them. He weighed the bags before and after. Once I found him standing by the trash can, sifting through the peelings and cores I had discarded. His hands moved methodically, his expression unreadable. When I confronted him, voice trembling, he only smiled. "Just making sure nothing goes to waste," he said. But I knew better. He wasn't saving scraps. He was checking my compliance. I began to feel like prey. Everywhere I went in the house, I felt his eyes. At breakfast, he lingered in the doorway. At lunch, he sat across from me, silent, watching each bite. At dinner, he slid apple slices onto my plate, no matter what I cooked. His gaze was heavy, suffocating, as though he could will me to chew faster, swallow deeper. And all the while, his words turned sweeter, gentler, even as his grip tightened. "You're glowing, Eleanor," he whispered one evening, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You've never looked so vibrant. Everyone notices. They're jealous of us, you know, of how perfect we are." Perfect. That word echoed like a curse. In the mirror, I didn't see perfection. I saw exhaustion. My skin had grown pale beneath the apple's red blush. My stomach churned constantly, my head ached with dull throbs, and my eyes carried shadows I could no longer hide. Yet Daniel insisted I was radiant. He paraded me like a prize, blind to the truth, or perhaps savoring it in some twisted way. The more he flaunted me, the more I realized how carefully he had constructed this image. To neighbors, I was the picture of health. To friends, I was disciplined, lucky to have such a caring husband. To myself, I was a prisoner dressed in apple skins. The scariest part was how easily they believed him. One afternoon, I overheard two women at the market talking as I walked past. "That Daniel Hayes," one said. "He takes such good care of Eleanor. My husband won't even remember to bring milk, and Daniel's out there buying her fresh fruit every day." The other laughed. "She's lucky. Men like that are rare. Lucky, if only they knew." But how could they? I never spoke. Fear sealed my lips shut, because what would happen if I dared to reveal the truth? Daniel had a way of twisting words, of making me seem irrational. Already, I had caught him telling people I was forgetful lately, or that I worried too much. He was laying the groundwork, preparing the stage where if I ever cried out, I'd look like the unstable one. It dawned on me then the apples weren't just his weapon, they were his alibi. If anyone ever suspected foul play, he could point to them, to me, to the endless praise he gave in public. I only ever tried to keep her healthy, he'd say, sorrowful and sincere. All those apples. I thought I was helping her. The perfect husband, the perfect wife, the perfect story. Except inside those walls I was crumbling. I remember one evening in particular. We hosted a dinner for a few colleagues of his. I cooked roasted chicken, vegetables, bread, a proper meal. But before the guests arrived, Daniel slipped into the kitchen and placed a large bowl of apple slices in the center of the table. "They'll want to see," he said. "Make sure you eat plenty tonight. When the guests sat down, he raised a toast. To Eleanor, he declared proudly, "The healthiest woman in town. No one eats like her." Everyone clapped. My cheeks burned. I picked up a slice, smiling tightly, chewing under their watchful eyes. The sweet taste stuck in my throat like glue. No one saw the tears I swallowed with each bite. After they left, Daniel gathered the empty plates, humming softly. He looked so content, so smug, that for a fleeting moment rage surged through me. I imagined grabbing the knife from the sink, ending it right there. But I didn't. Because even in my fury, I knew he had outmaneuvered me. If I acted rashly, the world would only see a hysterical wife destroying the perfect husband. No one would believe the truth about the apples. I needed proof. But more than that, I needed patience. And though my body ached with every forced mouthful, though my spirit bent under his gaze, a part of me hardened that night. I would not let him finish this performance. If he wanted the perfect wife on display, then I would play my role. I would smile, I would chew, I would nod at every compliment. But behind the mask, I was already planning. And Daniel, so blinded by his own act, would never see it coming. Nights became the hardest. I would lie beside Daniel, his breathing deep and steady, while my own chest rose and fell in uneven rhythms. My stomach twisted with the weight of the apples, a dull nausea that lingered long after the taste had left my tongue. My jaw ached from chewing, and my tongue bore faint cuts from seeds crushed under my teeth. I couldn't remember the last night I slept through without waking in cold sweats. One of those nights, while Daniel snored softly beside me, I slipped from the bed. The house was cloaked in silence, the kind of silence that presses on your ears until you almost hear your own blood moving. I padded barefoot to the kitchen, the floor cool beneath me, and turned on only the small light above the stove. The counter was crowded with bowls of apples. Red, green, yellow, they glistened under the light skins, taut shadows deep. They looked harmless, even inviting, but my body recoiled at the sight of them. It wasn't just my body rebelling anymore. It was my mind whispering questions I could no longer ignore. What was he really doing? Why was he so insistent? Why seeds, especially? I sat down at the table with my laptop, the screen's glow painting my face in pale blue. My hands trembled as I typed the words that had been gnawing at me for weeks. Are apple seeds poisonous? The answer appeared instantly, bright letters glaring back at me. Apple seeds contain amygdalin, which releases cyanide when digested. I froze. The words blurred for a moment as my heart slammed against my ribs. Cyanide. The word alone carried the weight of death. I scrolled further, breath, shallow. In small amounts, the human body can process it, but in larger, consistent doses, it can become dangerous, even fatal. I clutched the edge of the table, bile rising in my throat. Suddenly, Daniel's voice echoed in my memory. Don't waste the core. The seeds are the most important part. I pushed the laptop away as though the screen itself burned me. My hands shook uncontrollably. All this time, the nausea, the headaches, the exhaustion, it wasn't my imagination. It wasn't stress. It wasn't age. It was poison dripped into me seed by seed, day by day, disguised as love. Daniel wasn't obsessed with health. He was obsessed with control. And now I understood he wasn't trying to keep me alive. He was trying to kill me slowly so no one would suspect a thing. I pressed a hand over my mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. Because the most terrifying thought was not that he was poisoning me, it was that he was enjoying it. I sat in the kitchen for hours scrolling through articles, medical journals, survivalist forums. I read about symptoms of cyanide poisoning: nausea, weakness, headaches, confusion. All mine. Every single one. By dawn, my decision was clear. I had to stop eating the seeds. I had to stop giving him the satisfaction of watching me swallow them. But how he watched me too closely, monitored too carefully. I thought of all the times he hovered his eyes tracking my every move. The time he placed a seed I'd spit out back into my hand, ordering me to finish. The time he sifted through the trash, examining scraps for proof of my defiance. If I refused outright, what then? Would he drop the performance and reveal the predator beneath? Or worse, would he escalate, speed up his plan, make it less subtle, less deniable? I couldn't risk it. So I began small. The next morning, I chewed the flesh of the apples but palmed the seeds discreetly. When he wasn't looking, I slipped them into my sleeve, then excused myself to the bathroom and flushed them down the toilet. My heart raced each time, terrified he would hear the splash, would demand to see what I had discarded. Other days, I tucked the seeds into paper towels, folding them small, hiding them under layers of garbage. Once, I buried a handful in the dirt of my garden, pushing them beneath the soil with shaking hands, as though planting evidence of my own survival. But living like this was exhausting. Every moment became a performance within his performance. My smile, my chewing, my swallowing, all carefully choreographed. I had to play the role of the obedient wife while secretly rebelling in silence, and Daniel, for all his watchfulness, seemed satisfied. Perhaps too satisfied. He would sit across from me, arms crossed, lips curling in the faintest smile as he watched me chew. "That's it," he'd murmur. "That's my good girl." Each time he said it, rage and terror collided in my chest. At night, I returned to my laptop, searching obsessively for more. I read stories of historical poisonings, women silenced by husbands, husbands silenced by wives. I read about forensic detection of cyanide, about how it lingers only briefly in the body, leaving little trace. And then a darker realization dawned: if Daniel succeeded, no one would suspect him. They would see a widow grieving his health-obsessed wife who simply ate too many apples. He'd be pitied, comforted, admired. He had crafted the perfect murder plan, and I was already living inside it. One evening, while scrubbing dishes, I caught my reflection in the window. My face was thinner. My eyes shadowed my skin, sallow beneath the kitchen light. Daniel passed behind me, humming, carrying yet another bag of apples to the counter. He kissed my cheek and whispered, "You look beautiful." I met my own reflection's eyes, hollow and haunted, and thought, no, I look like a woman being erased. But not completely, not yet. Because I was still here. I still had strength left. And if he wanted to play this game, if he thought he could turn apples into weapons, then he hadn't counted on me finding my own way to fight back. That night, I started saving the seeds, not flushing them, not burying them. I placed them in a small glass jar tucked behind flour in the pantry. One by one, I collected them like evidence, like ammunition. If Daniel wanted to kill me with apples, then I would make sure those apples would one day tell the truth. When you live with someone long enough, you learn to dismiss certain things. Habits, quirks, the little idiosyncrasies that make them unique. Or in Daniel's case, the things that should have been warning signs. For years, I had brushed them off as peculiarities of a man set in his ways. The sharpness of his tone when I didn't fold towels the way he liked. His insistence that meals be plated a certain way with meat always at the center. The way he double-checked the locks at night, circling back to the door 3-4 times, jiggling the handle each time. But once the truth about the apple seeds settled in me, those quirks rearranged themselves into something else, not the harmless eccentricities of a husband, but the meticulous steps of a man obsessed with control. The memories came back sharper than I wanted them to. I remembered one dinner months before the apples began, when I had served a plate of roast chicken with vegetables. I'd placed an apple crisp on the side for dessert, proud of the warm sweetness filling the kitchen. But Daniel's eyes had gone immediately to the plate, his expression tightening. "You didn't core the apples properly," he said flatly. I blinked at him, confused. "What do you mean they're baked? The cores aren't—" "They matter," he interrupted, stabbing his fork into the crisp with almost violent precision. He lifted a piece, his gaze locked on me. "The core is where the real nutrients are. You should know that." At the time, I'd brushed it off as another of his strange health theories. But now, recalling it in the light of my late-night research, the words dripped with something far more sinister. The core, the seeds, the cyanide. How long had this plan been forming in his mind? Was the apple crisp just a test, a rehearsal for what was to come. And then there was the way he always reminded me like a mantra, eat everything, don't waste. At first it had sounded like thrift, the kind of lesson he might have carried from childhood. But paired with the apples with the seeds, it was no longer thrift. It was a demand, a directive, a trap disguised as wisdom. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The fatigue I'd been feeling for months, the constant headaches, the nausea that came and went in waves, all aligned with cyanide poisoning symptoms. Low doses, consistent, cumulative. The kind of poisoning that creeps in silently, so subtle that doctors might mistake it for stress diet or age. And wasn't that perfect for him? If I collapsed one day, Daniel would point to the very ritual he created. She was so healthy she ate all those apples. It must have been something else. A flawless alibi wrapped in shiny red skin. The thought made my skin crawl. But beyond the fear, anger began to simmer. For years, I had given him the benefit of the doubt. I had excused his controlling ways, softened his sharp edges with my silence. I had convinced myself that love was compromise, that a good wife adjusted, forgave, endured. And now I realized I had been enduring my own slow execution. I remember the exact moment the rage solidified into something stronger than fear. It was a Sunday morning. The sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, painting the table in golden stripes. Daniel was at the sink, carefully rinsing apples under the tap, humming softly. He lined them up on the counter like soldiers, each one polished until it gleamed. He turned to me with a smile that might have fooled anyone else. "A fresh batch," he said. "These are especially good. Make sure you eat them all today." I forced a nod, hiding the storm inside me. But as I watched him, I no longer saw a husband. I saw a man who had studied me like a puzzle, who had calculated every step of my daily life until I became nothing but a pawn in his quiet, patient game. A man who had decided that my life was expendable so long as he could script the story around it. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about the apples. The apples were simply the latest manifestation of a much larger truth. Daniel had always needed control. He had always needed to dictate, to command, to watch me bend under the weight of his rules. The apples were just the perfect tool, the perfect disguise. I thought back to other things, small details that now shone with new meaning. The way he discouraged me from seeing my doctor regularly. "They'll just run unnecessary tests," he'd said, waving it off whenever I mentioned scheduling a checkup. "You're healthier than most women your age. Trust me." Or the way he kept me away from handling finances directly. "You don't need to worry about the bills," he insisted. "I've got everything covered. Just focus on your health." Health. Always health. Always under his definition, his terms, his rules. He had been crafting this for longer than I realized. Preparing the ground, planting the seeds literally and figuratively until I was isolated, weakened, dependent. And then, like a gardener watching crops ripen, he began harvesting my decline day by day, apple by apple. The weight of that realization pressed down on me, but instead of breaking something inside me, steeled. Because if Daniel had a pattern, so could I. I began to plan with more intention. I didn't just hide the seeds now. I cataloged them. Each one went into the jar in the pantry, carefully labeled with dates, tiny notes in my hidden notebook about when I'd saved them and how I'd felt afterward. It became my secret counter ritual. Every time Daniel pressed an apple into my hand, every time he watched me chew, I thought of the jar in the pantry, my silent rebellion growing heavier with each seed. At night when he slept, I'd take it out, shake it gently, listen to the faint rattle. It was the sound of my survival, the sound of proof he could never erase. And with each day that passed, with each seed tucked away, I began to feel less like prey, and more like a hunter waiting for her moment. Every apple became a wager between life and death. By then I couldn't look at them without feeling sick. Their glossy skins, once innocent, seemed to mock me, reflecting back my pale, thinning face. Each time Daniel pressed one into my hand, my throat tightened and my stomach clenched, as though bracing for a blow. The act of eating, once ordinary, had turned into performance. I chewed slowly, pretending to savor swallowing flesh, but palming seeds, hiding them with rehearsed sleight of hand. It was exhausting, a theater I played daily under the gaze of my own husband. And oh, how he watched. At breakfast, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his eyes never leaving my mouth. At dinner, he set apples beside my plate no matter what else I'd cooked. He no longer asked if I'd eaten them, he demanded proof. One evening, I tried to excuse myself, claiming I wasn't feeling well. My stomach churned violently, the smell of the apples alone enough to send me reeling. Daniel's expression hardened. "You'll feel better once you eat," he said, sliding the bowl closer to me. "Daniel, please, Now, Eleanor." The softness was gone from his voice. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. His eyes glinted with something sharp, something that sent chills through my bones. I picked up the apple with trembling fingers and bit down. The taste was bitter, metallic, as though even the fruit itself knew it was being used as a weapon. I forced a smile, swallowing flesh while spitting seeds into my napkin when his back turned. That night, curled in bed with my stomach aching, I realized I was no longer just afraid of the apples. I was afraid of him. The fear spread into everything. I began to notice the way he tracked my movements in the house, how he lingered in doorways, silent, watching. If I lingered too long in the bathroom, he'd knock lightly, asking if I was all right. If I stepped outside for air, he followed within minutes, carrying an apple in his hand, as though it were an extension of himself. He was closing in, tightening the circle until there was no room left for me to breathe. And yet I had to keep pretending. Pretending to eat. Pretending to glow. Pretending to be the perfect wife he wanted the world to see. It was a dangerous game because the more I resisted in secret, the more suspicious he became. One afternoon he surprised me. I had tucked a few seeds into a napkin, intending to slip them into the trash later. But before I could, Daniel appeared suddenly at my side, too close, his hand reaching past mine to pluck the napkin from the counter. My heart stopped. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. For a moment I thought it was over. But inside there was nothing incriminating, just crumbs from the bread I'd eaten earlier. I had switched napkins at the last second without realizing, a desperate instinct that saved me. Daniel's lips curved into a small smile. "Careless, Eleanor," he murmured, tossing it into the bin. "You should clean up better." I forced a laugh, though my hands shook. Inside I was screaming. The paranoia ate at me. Every sound became a threat, every shadow a warning. I began waking at odd hours, tiptoeing to the pantry to check on my jar of seeds, terrified he might have discovered it. Each time it was still there, hidden behind the flour, rattling softly like a secret heartbeat. It was my only comfort, the only proof I had that I wasn't imagining any of this. But Daniel's control tightened still. One evening he brought out a knife and began slicing apples for me, placing each piece carefully on my plate. "No excuses," he said gently, though the edge in his voice was unmistakable. "I'll watch you finish every bite." I sat frozen, staring at the pale slices glistening under the kitchen light. Each one looked harmless, but I knew better. So I ate slowly, deliberately, while my mind raced. I chewed the flesh-slipped seeds into my sleeve when his eyes flickered elsewhere, and smiled when he praised me. "You see, you're strong. That's why I chose you, Eleanor." His words chilled me. Chose me. As though I were not a partner, but a specimen selected for some cruel experiment. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about his first wife. He rarely spoke of her, brushing off questions with vague answers. "She wasn't strong like you," he'd once said. "She had health issues." Health issues. I had never questioned it before. But now, lying awake with my stomach twisted in knots, I wondered, had she too eaten apples under his watchful eyes? Had she too grown pale and weak until one day she simply didn't wake up? The thought gnawed at me until sleep finally dragged me under. The next morning, I looked at Daniel differently. Not just as a controlling husband, not just as a manipulator, but as a man who had already practiced this plan once before, and survived it unscathed. My fear deepened, but so did my resolve. I realized I couldn't keep playing defense. I couldn't just spit seeds and hide evidence forever. If I wanted to survive, I needed to think like him, patient, deliberate, strategic. And though the terror pressed down on me, though every apple felt like a loaded gun placed in my mouth, I whispered to myself in the dark, "Not yet. Not today. You won't win, Daniel. Not this time." Because if he thought he was the only one capable of playing a long game, he was wrong. And one day I would turn his perfect plan against him. It reached a point where Daniel stopped pretending this was about health. Before, he cloaked his obsession in soft words, praise, and the performance of a devoted husband. But now the mask was slipping. The sweetness in his tone grew thinner, brittle, cracking under the weight of his demand for absolute obedience. He began insisting on being present for every meal. At breakfast, he brewed his coffee and sat across from me, hands folded, eyes fixed on my plate, as though my chewing were entertainment. At lunch, he came home early from work, claiming he missed me but always placing another apple in front of me. And at dinner, no matter what else I cooked, he brought out a fresh bowl of apples, slicing them himself, arranging them neatly in front of me like an altar sacrifice. "I want to see you eat all of it," he said one night, pushing a plate toward me. "No shortcuts, Eleanor. Not this time." The apple lay in pale slices, glistening under the kitchen light. I picked one up, my hand trembling, and bit down. The sweetness was tinged with bitterness, that metallic tang I'd come to dread. Daniel leaned forward slightly, watching me chew, his eyes dark and hungry. "Good. Keep going." I forced myself to swallow. The skin scratched my throat, the seeds grinding between my teeth. I slipped a few into my palm, hiding them beneath the table, but he noticed the hesitation. "Open your hand," he said suddenly. My heart stuttered. "What? Your hand?" He repeated, his voice low but firm. "Open it." Panic surged through me. I clenched tighter, desperate, then feigned a cough, clutching my napkin to my lips. I spat discreetly into it, wiping at my mouth, as though struggling to breathe. Seed caught in my throat. I gasped, folding the napkin tightly. Daniel's expression softened just enough. He reached out, rubbing my back. "Careful, Eleanor. But don't waste it next time. The core matters most." I nodded, swallowing my fear along with the taste still clinging to my tongue. Every bite felt like a gamble now, every movement rehearsed in my mind before I dared make it. I had become an actress in my own kitchen, performing the role of loyal wife, all while silently hiding pieces of evidence in napkin sleeves, even slipping them into my pockets when I dared. But the pressure was suffocating. Sometimes he'd insist on feeding me himself. He would pick up a slice, hold it between his fingers, and press it against my lips until I opened my mouth. The intimacy was grotesque, a violation masquerading as care. His eyes locked on mine, daring me to resist. And always, always, he reminded me, "Don't leave anything behind." I began to wonder if he enjoyed this more than the outcome. Watching me bend, watching me choke down his poison, watching me smile through tears, perhaps that was his real pleasure. But even in the suffocating grip of his control, I learned to adapt. I practiced sleight of hand until it became second nature, a seed hidden beneath my tongue. A slice slipped into my sleeve while I dabbed at my mouth with a napkin. Sometimes I let him see me chew and swallow, only to regurgitate quietly into the sink hours later, running water to mask the sound. It was degrading, humiliating, exhausting, but it kept me alive. The more I resisted, the more frustrated he became. His patience, once endless, began to fray. "You don't trust me," he accused one night, his voice sharp. "After everything I do for you, after how I take care of you, you still fight me." "Why?" I forced a smile, though my heart raced. "I do trust you, Daniel. I'm just tired sometimes. It's a lot of apples." His jaw tightened. "You'll get used to it. Discipline is love. I thought you understood that. Discipline is love." The words clung to me like a curse. That night, lying in bed, I thought of how he spoke to me like a parent scolding a child, how his every word dripped with superiority. He wasn't just trying to poison me. He wanted me to submit willingly, to offer myself up, slice by slice, seed by seed. And I realized that was the ultimate test. It wasn't enough for him to kill me. He wanted me to participate in my own destruction, smiling all the way down. The thought made my blood run cold, but it also sharpened something inside me. Because if he wanted me to play obedient, then I would play better than he imagined. The next day, I ate with apparent eagerness, smiling as I lifted each slice, chewing with exaggerated satisfaction. I even let out a soft laugh, saying, "You really do take care of me, Daniel." He beamed, pride flooding his face. "See, you're starting to understand." But behind my smile, I was already planning. I collected more seeds than ever, filling my jar until it grew heavy in my hands. I added labels, dates, meticulous notes, each detail building a case he would never expect me to be crafting. And slowly I began to think not just of survival, but of reversal. If he wanted me to eat every seed, then perhaps one day he would taste what he had prepared for me. The idea was terrifying, intoxicating, dangerous, but it gave me strength. For now, I would keep playing his game. I would keep smiling, chewing, swallowing. But deep down, I whispered to myself the promise that kept me alive. "One day, Daniel, one day you'll eat the apples too." The jar in the pantry rattled heavier with each passing day. Seeds upon seeds, tiny dark remnants of Daniel's ritual, growing into my private archive of defiance. I often held it in my hands late at night, the faint rattle whispering back to me, "You're not imagining this. You're not crazy. This is real." But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed context. I needed motive. And most of all, I needed proof that Daniel wasn't simply a controlling husband, but a predator who had done this before. The answer came not from him, but from a neighbor. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had forced myself to step outside just to breathe air not scented by apples. The sun was sharp, the sky wide and blue. Mrs. Adler, who lived 2 doors down, spotted me tending the roses and wandered over. She was in her late 70s, a woman with a sharp tongue softened only by years of widowhood. "You're looking thin, Eleanor," she said, peering at me over her glasses. "Is everything all right? Daniel keeps bragging about how healthy you are." I forced a weak smile. "I'm fine. Just tired, I suppose." She studied me a moment longer, then sighed. "You know, you remind me of his first wife sometimes." Poor thing. She had the same look near the end, pale, quiet, always sick to her stomach. Her words pierced me like ice. I gripped the pruning shears too tightly. His first wife. Mrs. Adler blinked, surprised. "Oh, did he never tell you much about her? Julia, her name was?" "Lovely woman. Died so suddenly. Stomach troubles, they said. Some kind of digestive failure. It was all very tragic." The world tilted around me. "Digestive troubles," I echoed faintly. Mrs. Adler nodded. "Yes, that's what Daniel told us. Always said he did everything he could for her. Brought her fresh food every day, tried to keep her strong. He was praised for being such a devoted husband. We all admired him, truth be told." I managed a polite nod, but inside the storm was raging. Stomach troubles, a sudden death, a husband praised for his devotion. It was the same story repeating itself, only this time I was Julia's replacement. That night I sat in the kitchen long after Daniel had gone to bed. The jar of seeds sat in front of me, heavy and accusing. I ran my fingers over the glass, thinking of Julia. Had she noticed the bitterness in the apples? Had she felt the same nausea, the same exhaustion, the same dread? Had she suspected even in her final days that the man feeding her was not saving her, but killing her? And worst of all, had she died alone with that realization, silenced before she could speak? I couldn't stop shaking. The pieces were falling into place too neatly. His obsession with health, his need to control every bite, his refusal to let me see doctors, his discouragement of my independence. And now, the revelation that another woman, the woman before me, had wasted away under his care. Her death wrapped in the neat package of tragedy. Daniel wasn't experimenting, he was perfecting. And I was the second draft. The next morning, I tried to look at him the way I had before, to see just my husband, the man who once kissed my forehead and whispered promises of forever. But all I saw was a predator cloaked in domestic routine. A man who had learned how to kill without raising suspicion, who relished the applause of others as he paraded his devotion. He had already gotten away with it once, and he believed with absolute certainty that he would get away with it again. But not this time. Not with me. The rage inside me solidified into something cold, something deliberate. Survival was no longer enough. I couldn't simply avoid his seeds forever, couldn't simply hide them in jars and hope he slipped up. Because if he grew suspicious, if he realized I knew, he would accelerate his plan. And then I would end like Julia. No, I needed to end this on my terms. That night, while Daniel hummed in the living room, polishing apples like precious stones, I opened my notebook and began to write with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Dates of when he bought the apples. How many he brought each day. My symptoms after eating them. His exact words: don't waste the core. Eat everything. Discipline is love. And now the revelation of Julia, his first wife, and her so-called stomach troubles. I wrote feverishly, my hand cramping, but I didn't stop. Every detail was a weapon. Every memory, once painful, became a brick in the wall I was building against him. When I finally stopped, the notebook pages were filled, my handwriting jagged but steady. I tucked it beneath the false bottom of my dresser drawer, hidden where only I would know to look. And then I returned to the pantry, unscrewed the lid of the jar, and stared at the seeds. Hundreds of them rattling softly, smelling faintly of bitterness. Julia hadn't had this chance. She hadn't had proof, hadn't had time. But I did. As I screwed the lid back on, I whispered into the quiet kitchen, I won't let him win again. Not with me. The fear that had once paralyzed me was morphing into something else. A sharpness, a clarity, a resolve that for the first time felt stronger than his control. Because now I wasn't just Eleanor, the obedient wife choking down apples. I was Eleanor the survivor, Eleanor the witness, and soon I would be Eleanor the avenger. From that day forward, every moment of my life with Daniel became a battle fought in silence. I smiled when he expected it. I laughed softly at his little jokes, nodded at his constant instructions. I played the part of the grateful wife so convincingly that even I almost believed it sometimes. But underneath that mask, every glance, every word, every apple was recorded and stored away, ammunition for the war I was quietly waging. The jar in the pantry had become my secret companion. What started as a handful of hidden seeds had grown into dozens, then hundreds. Each one carried weight beyond its size, not just physical proof, but symbolic resistance. With every rattle of that jar, I reminded myself I am not Julia. I will not vanish. But seeds alone weren't enough. I needed a narrative, a timeline that even Daniel's charm couldn't spin into devotion. So I began documenting in earnest. Every morning, after choking down apple flesh under his watchful eye, I'd retreat to the bathroom and jot down notes in my little notebook. My handwriting had become hurried, almost frantic, but the details were precise. March 14th, severe nausea, headache after 3 apples, chewed seeds spat out. March 15th, Daniel insisted I eat everything, watched closely, saved 12 seeds. March 16th, neighbor Mrs. Adler spoke of Julia's sudden digestive death. On and on the pages filled. Symptoms, confrontations, his words, my evasions. Even the smallest detail, a shift in his tone, the glint in his eyes when I obeyed, went into the record. It wasn't just for me anymore. It was for whoever would need to see the truth should the worst happen. And yet, as the evidence grew, so, too did the danger. Daniel was becoming more restless, less patient. He noticed the weariness in my body, the slight trembling in my hands. He thought it was progress, his plan unfolding as intended. "You're softer now," he said once, stroking my cheek as though admiring his handiwork. "The apples are doing their work." I forced a smile, though bile rose in my throat. But his watchfulness meant I had to become sharper in my deceptions. I learned to pocket seeds mid-bite, slipping them into my sleeve with the ease of a magician. I learned to fake swallowing, tilting my head just right then, coughing into a napkin to hide the evidence. I learned to let him believe he was winning even as my jar grew heavier by the day. And I learned something else too, how to use his arrogance against him. Daniel thrived on the illusion of control. The more obedient I seemed, the more comfortable he became, lowering his guard. I leaned into that, offering him smiles, compliments, even gratitude. "Thank you for looking after me," I said one evening after he pressed another apple into my hand. "No one has ever cared about my health like you do." He beamed pride, lighting his face. "Exactly, Eleanor. That's why you're still here. Because of me." His words chilled me, but I tucked away the moment in memory, another line from my notebook. "Daniel believes my survival depends on him. His ego blinds him, and that blindness became my weapon." The more he boasted, the more he revealed. I noticed how he spoke about Julia in rare, almost accidental slips. "She resisted more than you," he muttered once, almost to himself, when I hesitated with a bite. My blood ran cold, but I pretended not to hear, nodding as if distracted. Another time, after I dutifully finished a plate of apple slices under his watchful eye, he whispered, "You're better at this than she ever was." Confirmation, as damning as any written confession. I wrote those words down the moment he left the room, my hand shaking with both horror and relief. Horror at his brazenness, relief at the proof. I was no longer just surviving, I was gathering the threads of his noose. But with every small victory, my fear grew sharper. Because one mistake, one slip of the hand could mean the end. One evening, as I tucked away seeds into a napkin, Daniel's eyes flicked to my hands too quickly. My heart stopped. "What are you hiding?" he asked. I forced a nervous laugh, holding up the napkin. "Nothing, just a mess. Juice everywhere." He stared at me for a long moment, then slowly smiled. "Careless, Eleanor. You should know better than to waste." He let it go. But his eyes stayed on me longer that night, as though weighing my obedience, measuring my worth. I knew then that time was running out. If he suspected me even for a moment, he might accelerate his plan. The slow poison could turn into something swifter, and then all my evidence would mean nothing. So I began considering the unthinkable. What if, instead of waiting for Daniel to tighten the noose, I handed him the rope myself? The thought terrified me, but it also sparked something fierce inside. For weeks, I had been collecting seeds, notes, symptoms, proof of his crime. But proof meant little if I didn't survive to show it. Maybe survival required more than resistance. Maybe it required reversal. The idea was intoxicating, dangerous, thrilling. To imagine Daniel sitting where I sat, chewing obediently under watchful eyes, swallowing what he had so carefully prepared for me. I wasn't ready yet. Not quite. But the possibility hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. That night, as I screwed the lid back onto my jar of seeds, I whispered into the silence, "You taught me discipline, Daniel. You taught me patience. And one day, you'll regret it." For the first time in months, I didn't just feel fear. I felt power. It began like any other evening, except the air in the house felt heavier, thicker, as though even the walls were holding their breath. Daniel had been humming all afternoon, a low tune that sent unease crawling up my spine. He moved around the kitchen with unusual energy, chopping, stirring, baking. The smell of apples filled every corner, richer and sweeter than ever, almost cloying. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the entire house reeked of them. When he finally called me to the table, my heart sank. The spread before me looked like a feast from a glossy magazine. A golden pie still steaming, a crisp salad sprinkled with apple slices, glazed chicken basted with apple cider, even a pitcher of freshly pressed juice that gleamed amber in the light. But to me it looked like a death sentence. "Tonight's special," Daniel said, his eyes bright. I thought it was time for a real celebration. Celebration. My voice was thin, wary. He leaned closer, his hand brushing mine with mock tenderness. "We've come so far, Eleanor. You've been so disciplined, so obedient. I think you're ready to finish what we started." The words chilled me to the bone. He placed a plate in front of me, piling it high with apple-laden dishes. Then he sat across from me, not touching his own plate, his eyes locked on mine. "Tonight," he said softly, "you'll finish everything." My stomach clenched violently. I forced a small smile, hiding the terror surging in me. This wasn't just another meal. This was it, the culmination of his plan. He wasn't going to wait any longer for his slow poison to finish the job. Tonight, he wanted closure. I picked up my fork, my hand trembling slightly, and speared a slice of apple from the salad. The crunch echoed in my ears as I chewed. The flesh was bitter, acrid. I forced it down my throat, burning. "Good," Daniel whispered, leaning forward, eyes gleaming. "Keep going." Piece by piece, bite by bite, I went through the motions, chewing, swallowing, smiling when he demanded it. All the while, my mind raced. I thought of Julia, his first wife, sitting at her own table, perhaps, with the same spread before her, perhaps with the same expectant eyes fixed on her. Had she realized in time, or had she eaten until her body gave out, believing to the end that it was just her failing stomach? I would not end like her, but I couldn't act rashly either. If I faltered, if he saw through me, he would strike in another way, something faster, something worse. So I played my role with care. I pretended to savor the pie cutting into its golden crust, though the filling was syrupy with seeds I pushed discreetly aside. I lifted the glass of cider, sipping slowly, palming droplets onto my napkin as though by accident. I chewed chicken glazed and apple reduction, swallowing flesh, while slipping bitter fragments of seed under my tongue to spit out later. Daniel never took his eyes off me. His gaze was heavy, predatory, savoring my obedience. "You see," he murmured, "this is what love looks like. You and I completing this together." Love. The word struck me like venom. Love wasn't forcing poison into the woman you vowed to protect. Love wasn't trapping her in silence, watching her waste away for your pleasure. This wasn't love. This was ownership. This was death dressed in devotion. But I smiled anyway, wiping my mouth delicately with the napkin hiding the seeds. "You're right," I whispered. "It does feel like love." His grin widened, satisfied. The performance continued for nearly an hour, the food stretching endlessly before me, each bite heavier than the last. My stomach burned, my throat raw, but I didn't let him see. Finally, as the last plate emptied, Daniel leaned back, sighing contentedly. "Perfect. You've done it, Eleanor. I'm proud of you." My heart pounded in my chest, fear and rage colliding until my hands shook under the table. Proud of me. Proud of watching me eat what he thought would end me. But he didn't know. He didn't know about the seeds tucked in my sleeve, the juice spilled discreetly into the napkin, the tiny deceptions that had kept me alive. He thought the feast was mine, but it wasn't. It was his rehearsal. And soon, very soon, I would turn rehearsal into finale. That night, when he finally drifted to sleep beside me, I slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen. The jar of seeds was heavier than ever, almost too heavy to lift quietly. I unscrewed the lid and let the bitter smell hit me sharp and acrid. Hundreds of seeds collected in silence, proof of his plan, proof of his cruelty. And perhaps, if I found the courage, the very weapon to end it. I held the jar close, whispering into the dark. "Not much longer, Daniel. The feast you prepared for me will one day be yours." The fear inside me hadn't vanished. It never would. But it was no longer just fear. It was resolve sharpened to a blade. And for the first time since the apples began, I felt the faintest taste of victory. The days after the feast felt like walking across a frozen lake, every step careful, every breath shallow, terrified the ice would crack beneath me. Daniel was pleased with himself more than I had seen in months. He carried himself with the smug air of a man who believed he had won, who thought the story was already written, the ending inevitable. He began talking of the future in vague hints that chilled me. "You won't have to worry about much longer," he murmured one morning as he packed apples into the fridge. "Things will be simpler soon." Simpler. For him, perhaps. A life without Eleanor, without resistance, without eyes that saw too much. But what he didn't realize was that his confidence had become my opportunity. I had learned everything I needed. I had collected the evidence. I had gathered the seeds, hundreds of them, proof of his meticulous cruelty. And most importantly, I had studied his arrogance long enough to know he would never see me coming. So I began to prepare my counterattack. I did it slowly, cautiously, layering obedience over defiance. I became softer in his eyes, weaker, more pliant. I let him believe the poison was working, that I was slipping further under his control. I thanked him more often, smiled at his words, let him feed me slices with his own hands, swallowing them with docile nods. And when he wasn't looking, I worked. The jar of seeds in the pantry had become my arsenal. At night, I ground a portion of them into powder with a mortar and pestle I kept hidden in the shed. The smell was bitter, sharp enough to sting my nose. I stored the fine dust in a small glass vial, tucking it carefully behind the flour sacks. Every rattle of that vial reminded me of Julia, of all the nights I had nearly broken, of all the mornings I had forced myself to smile through his cruelty. It reminded me of why I would not fail. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Daniel announced one evening, his voice brimming with anticipation, that he wanted to host a special dinner for just the two of us. A night to remember, he called it, placing his hand over mine. His touch was warm, but his eyes glinted with the cold certainty of a man sealing his victory. I understood then. This was to be my final performance, the night he believed his plan would end in triumph. But it would not end the way he thought. The day of the dinner, I moved like a woman possessed. While Daniel went out for his usual errands, which I knew included his ritual apple purchase, I slipped into the kitchen and prepared. The vial of ground seeds came out of hiding, my hands trembling as I poured the bitter dust into the sauces, the cider, the pie filling he had so carefully left ready for me to bake. By the time he returned, the house already smelled of warm apples, cinnamon, and sugar. He smiled as he set down his bag. "Perfect, Eleanor. You've finally embraced it." I forced a smile, my heart pounding so hard it shook my ribs. "It's what you wanted, isn't it? A meal to remember?" When we sat at the table that evening, the spread looked familiar. Apple salad, glazed chicken, golden pie, cider glistening in tall glasses. But this time I had made sure every dish carried the bitterness he had intended for me. He raised his glass eyes gleaming. "To us," he said. I lifted mine, my hand steady despite the storm inside. "To us." We drank. The bitterness was masked by sugar and spice, subtle enough that he didn't notice. He smiled as he swallowed, savoring the taste of what he thought was victory. "Eat, Eleanor," he urged, pushing the pie toward me. "Tonight we finish everything together." I took a small bite, enough to appease him, tucking the rest discreetly aside. He, on the other hand, devoured with confidence, slice after slice, sip after sip of cider. His appetite, fueled by arrogance, became my ally. With each bite, he took my pulse, steadied. For the first time in months, I felt control tilt in my direction. Halfway through the meal, he paused, frowning slightly. He rubbed his stomach, then forced a smile. "Strong flavor tonight," he said. "Yes," I whispered, meeting his eyes. "A bit bitter, isn't it?" He blinked, surprised at my tone. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face, then suspicion. His fork clattered softly against the plate as he set it down. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice low, dangerous. I leaned forward, my own voice steady. "What you taught me, Daniel. Discipline. Patience. You wanted me to eat everything. And now, so will you." His face paled, sweat breaking across his forehead. He tried to rise, but his legs trembled, his body betraying him. "You think you can beat me?" he hissed, gripping the edge of the table. "I don't think," I said softly, my voice cold as steel. "I know." The bitterness of apples still lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. But for the first time, it wasn't my burden. It was his. As he staggered back, collapsing into his chair, gasping for breath, I sat perfectly still, watching. Not with fear, not with regret, but with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had finally turned the tables. The perfect murder plan had been his, but the perfect reversal was mine. The house was silent except for the ragged sound of his breath. Daniel slumped in the chair across from me, his face pale, his shirt clinging with sweat. His hands clutched at the table as though holding on to control that was already slipping through his fingers. The feast he had so carefully prepared, his masterpiece, his perfect plan, lay scattered between us. half-eaten, heavy with the bitterness of the seeds I had hidden away for months. I sat perfectly still, my fingers curled around the stem of my glass, my eyes fixed on him. For months he had watched me like this, savoring my discomfort, measuring my obedience. Now the gaze was mine. "What did you do?" he gasped, his voice breaking. I leaned forward, my voice steady, even soft. "I did what you taught me, Daniel. I didn't waste. I finished the cores. I saved the seeds. All those nights you thought I obeyed. I was learning." His eyes widened, realization, dawning horror etched across his face. It was a strange thing watching a man lose control when he had built his life on owning it. His arrogance, his patience, his cruel ritual, all undone by the same precision he had weaponized against me. I should have felt triumph. And in a way I did. But more than anything, I felt the weight of betrayal pressing against my chest. This was the man I had trusted, the man I had shared decades with. The man who once kissed me goodnight and whispered promises of forever. And yet, behind those promises, he had hidden a plan to erase me slowly, quietly, without a trace. How do you reconcile love with murder? How do you carry the knowledge that the person who vowed to protect you wanted nothing more than to watch you wither away? I don't think I ever will, but I do know this: I survived. Not because he allowed me to, not because I was lucky, but because I learned to fight with silence, with patience, with discipline. The very tools he used against me became the weapons I turned back on him. As his body weakened, his head slumped forward, I stood and walked to the pantry. I pulled out the jar of seeds, heavy, rattling, reeking of bitterness, and set it on the table before him. "This is what you made me," I whispered. "Every lie, every seed, every bite you forced down my throat. You thought you were writing my death sentence, but all the while you were writing your own." He stared at the jar, lips trembling, but no words came. Moments later, silence filled the room again. And just like that, it was over. The days that followed were a blur. Police, questions, shocked neighbors whispering in hushed voices. I handed over my notebook, the jar of seeds, every scrap of proof I had collected. They looked at me with disbelief, some with pity, some with admiration. Mrs. Adler, my neighbor, squeezed my hand as I sat on the porch the next morning. "I always knew something was wrong," she murmured. "Julia would be proud of you." Julia, the woman who hadn't made it out. I carried her memory with me, the shadow of her suffering woven into my own survival. She hadn't had the chance to fight back, but I had. And I refused to let her story vanish with mine. For weeks, I couldn't eat an apple. The smell alone sent waves of nausea crashing through me. But one day, I forced myself to slice one open, to stare at the core, at the seeds that had nearly become my undoing. And instead of fear, I felt something else: power. Because those seeds, once his weapon, had become my testimony. Slowly, life moved forward. The kitchen grew quieter, freer, no longer suffocated by the endless bags he dragged home. The air smelled not of apples, but of flowers again. My reflection in the mirror no longer looked haunted, but alive. Survival wasn't clean. It never is. Some nights I still wake hearing his voice whispering, "Don't waste the core." But when I do, I remind myself I am still here. He is not. And that is enough. Fade out to audience. When I tell this story, people always ask me, "How did you find the strength?" The truth is, I didn't feel strong. Not once. I felt terrified, trapped, and small. But strength isn't about feeling fearless. It's about acting despite the fear, about refusing to let someone else write the ending to your story. My husband thought he had the perfect murder plan. He thought patience and arrogance would win. But he underestimated the one thing he could never control: me. So now I'll ask you, the ones listening. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation like this? Have you ever suspected betrayal hidden under the guise of love? What would you have done in my place? How do you think the world would have seen him if I hadn't collected the proof? Would they have called him a devoted husband, a grieving widower, while I became nothing more than another silent Julia? Think about it. And tell me, would you forgive Or would you take revenge? Because sometimes survival itself is the sweetest revenge of all. So before you go, share your thoughts below. And if you have a story of betrayal or survival, don't keep it hidden. Tell it. Someone out there may need to hear it. And of course, subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories like mine. Because the truth always finds its way out, even when it hides inside an apple core.